The steel baton swung down across the dining hall of the Salt Line, aimed straight at the most powerful man in Boston, and his 19-year-old sister standing right in its path. Guests screamed and scattered like a breaking wave. The bodyguards froze, not one of them quick enough to move. Only one person ran forward, not away but straight into the danger. A thin 27-year-old waitress in a worn uniform and flat shoes with the heels rubbed down, someone who'd been scolded just 5 minutes earlier for dropping a tray. She shoved the young girl out of the baton's path and threw her own back into the blow. The sharp crack of breaking bone echoed across the cold marble floor. And as she crumpled, pulling the stranger tight against her chest, she whispered just one thing: "Don't be afraid, I'm here now." The man in the tailored black suit, a faint scar running along his jaw, gray eyes that had never known fear, dropped to his knees beside the woman who'd just saved his sister's life. Rafe Collazo had made an entire city bow its head, had ordered life and death with a single nod. But tonight, for the first time in his life, he couldn't make sense of what he'd just seen. Why would someone with nothing, someone the world itself had turned its back on, trade her own life for a complete stranger? Who is Maeve Donovan? And why did she run toward that danger when everyone else only knew how to run away? The answer will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about the worth of a single human being. If this story touches your heart, hit that like button so it can reach more people. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still exists. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. But to understand how someone like Maeve Donovan could do such a thing, we must go back a few hours earlier, before the night had broken open into screams. By 6 o'clock in the evening, as sunset stretched long across the glass windows of the Salt Line restaurant, Maeve was already exhausting herself into her second shift of the day, the one she had asked to take even though no one else wanted it, because the heels of her flat shoes had worn down so badly that every step rubbed against the blistered skin of her feet. She did not complain. She had learned not to complain a very long time ago. In the pocket of her apron, folded into quarters and hidden behind her order pad, was a piece of paper she had read over and over until she knew every number by heart. A hospital bill. Beneath it was a line printed in bold, reminding her of a surgery that could no longer be delayed, a surgery for the small heart beating weakly inside the chest of her 9-year-old little brother. Finn. Every time her hand brushed that paper while she cleared a table, his face rose before her. That pale little face still trying to smile each morning when she left for work, that soft voice reminding her not to work too hard. In her wallet, she kept a photograph with worn edges, showing Finn sitting on the steps of the cramped apartment they shared, his arms wrapped around a faded, stuffed bear. And it was the only thing that kept her moving through nights when she thought she had no strength left. That afternoon, before her shift, she had sat in a small office at the bank, both hands clasped tightly under the table, listening as they explained in a polite but cold voice that her loan application had been denied. It was the last door she had left to knock on. She had gone everywhere she could go, signed every paper she could sign, begged with every last shred of pride a 27-year-old woman could gather. People looked at the pay stub of a waitress, glanced at the debts piled high, and shook their heads. They did not see the nights she stayed awake beside Finn's bed when he struggled for breath. They did not see the mother who had died when Maeve was only 18, the father who had sunk into bottles of liquor and then vanished from the lives of both siblings without a single goodbye. They saw only numbers, and the numbers said she was not worth trusting. Maeve had walked out of the bank building with dry eyes, because she had cried herself empty years ago, and tears were a luxury she no longer allowed herself to spend. On her way to the restaurant, she stopped by Mrs. Alvarez's apartment. The kind neighbor who watched Finn for her every evening pressed a little loose change into the woman's hand and kissed the forehead of the boy sleeping inside. She did not tell Finn that the loan had been denied. She had never allowed her burdens to fall onto his thin shoulders. To Finn, she was always the strong older sister, the one who always found a way, the one who always smiled and said everything would be all right. And now, standing inside the elegant restaurant where one guest's dinner cost as much as a week of her wages, Maeve tightened her grip on the tray in her hands and reminded herself that she was not allowed to fall apart. This shift, then the next shift, and all the shifts she would ask for after that, dollar by dollar, cent by cent, she would gather enough. She had to gather enough. because that small heart could not wait forever, and because in this world, Finn had no one left but her. Across the dining room, the bright laughter of people who had never known what it meant to count every coin in order to survive rang out like music from another life. Maeve drew in a deep breath, fixed the professional smile back onto her lips, and walked toward the waiting tables. She could not have known that in only a few hours, this night that seemed like nothing more than another exhausting shift would become the night that changed everything. The night when the life of an unknown waitress collided with the life of the most powerful man in the city. That evening, the Salt Line welcomed an important party, and that meant Gerald Moss. The manager was in his most strained state. Moss was a man in his 50s, with slicked-back oiled hair, a custom suit fitted over a body beginning to thicken, and an attitude he mistook for authority, when in truth it was only contempt polished to a shine. To Moss, servers were not human beings. They were walking tools, shadows that were supposed to be silent and invisible, allowed to appear only when wine needed pouring or plates needed clearing, then expected to vanish at once. And among all those shadows, Moss seemed especially fond of aiming at Maeve, perhaps because she was the least likely to fight back, the one he knew would swallow every cruel word, because she needed this job more than anyone else. Maeve was clearing a table whose guests had just left when Moss swept past, his eyes moving over the tablecloth and stopping on a faint stain, a small spill of red wine the previous guest had made, and that she had not yet had time to change. He stopped sharply, and her whole body went cold, because she knew what was coming. "Miss," Moss said, not loudly, but sharply enough to cut through the restaurant noise, loudly enough that a few guests at the next table lifted their heads. "You call this service?" Maeve turned back, both hands still holding a tray of dirty dishes, and she tried to keep her voice calm. "Mr. Moss, the guest just spilled it." I was about to change the cloth right now, but Moss was not listening. He never listened. He stepped closer, lowering his voice into a poisonous whisper even more unpleasant than shouting. "Do you know who those guests are? Do you know how a stain like this makes the restaurant look? Or is your head only big enough to count how much you'll make in tips tonight?" A few small laughs sounded somewhere nearby, and Maeve felt her cheeks burn. Not because she was ashamed of the stain on the tablecloth, but because of the way people were looking at her now, as though she were something lowly, a mistake that needed correcting. She lowered her head, not because she believed she was wrong, but because she had learned that lowering her head was the cheapest way to let a storm pass. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I'll change it right away." Moss folded his arms across his chest, savoring his small moment of power. "One more time," he said. "Just one more time I see carelessness like this from you, and I'll take it straight out of your wages. Or better yet, I'll find someone else who knows how to work. You think there aren't people out there who want a job here?" The words cut deeper than he knew, because Moss had no idea what every dollar of that wage meant to her, no idea that every time he threatened to dock her pay, he was threatening to take away part of the fragile hope folded inside her apron pocket, the hope called surgery, a small heart, a little brother waiting for his sister to come home. Maeve nodded, murmured another apology, then turned away to replace the tablecloth with hands that trembled faintly while she tried to hide it. She would not let herself cry in this place, not in front of Moss, not in front of the diners who had returned to their meals, as though nothing had happened, as though a human being trampled before their eyes was merely part of the background. And perhaps that was the most heartbreaking thing of all. Not Moss's insults, but the indifference of the entire room, the way a restaurant full of people could witness someone's dignity being ground underfoot, and not one person feel the need to speak. Maeve spread the fresh cloth over the table, smoothed every fold flat, and told herself that she did not need anyone to defend her, that she was used to standing alone. She could not have known that in a hidden corner of the restaurant, a pair of gray eyes had quietly watched the whole thing, a man accustomed to giving orders rather than observing, and yet tonight he was studying that thin waitress with an unreadable expression, as though for the first time in his life he had come across something money and power had never been able to buy for him. Just as Maeve was smoothing the fresh tablecloth flat, the main doors of the Salt Line opened, and a subtle change spread through the room like a passing chill of wind that everyone felt even though no one could name it. The man who stepped in was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, his stride unhurried yet certain, And the strange thing was that, although he did not say a word or make a single gesture, the staff standing near the door automatically leaned aside to give him room. The hostess, who had been speaking sharply to guests, suddenly bowed her head with a politeness so deep it was almost servile, and even Gerald Moss, the man who only minutes earlier had been preening as he handed out cruelty, hurriedly straightened his tie and rushed forward to greet him with a fawning smile Maeve had never seen on his face before. The man was Rafe Colazzo, and though Maeve did not know his name, she understood at once that he was the kind of man the whole world made way for, the kind of man whose presence changed the air in a room. But tonight, Rafe had not come here as someone the entire city feared. Tonight, he had come as an older brother. Walking beside him was a 19-year-old girl with long black hair falling loose, bright shining eyes, and the unguarded smile of someone who had never tasted life's darkness. This was Cecily, his younger sister, and today was her birthday. Rafe had reserved a table here weeks ago, and he had done something those closest to him considered reckless. He had not brought his usual circle of guards. He had allowed only Silvana Reyes, the 40-year-old woman who had always stood behind him like a shadow, to come with them and sit at a table a few steps away. Sal, as everyone called her, had objected to this. In her usual level voice, she had told him that taking Cecily out without enough protection was an unnecessary risk. But Rafe had shaken his head. He wanted his sister to have an ordinary evening, just one evening, to sit in a beautiful restaurant without being surrounded by cold-faced men, to laugh and talk like any other 19-year-old girl, without feeling like a hostage inside her own life. Cecily was all that remained of the world. Rafe had known before everything collapsed, and he had sacrificed so much, had become a man he sometimes no longer recognized in the mirror, only so she could grow up safe, educated, and still in possession of the innocence he had lost far too young. For her, he was willing to lower his walls, even if only for one evening. When brother and sister were led to their table, Rafe sat down with an outwardly relaxed posture, but his gray eyes never stopped doing the work that years of living in danger had turned into instinct. He glanced toward every exit, memorized the door leading into the kitchen at the back, measured the distance to the front entrance, swept over every face in the room, and sorted them into two kinds, threat or not. That was how he survived, the way a man in his position had to live, even in moments that seemed most peaceful. But then his eyes stopped, not on an exit or a danger, but on a thin waitress carrying a tray in the corner of the room, the woman he had accidentally witnessed being humiliated by the manager only minutes before. There was something in the way she held her back straight after being trampled, in the way she smoothed the tablecloth as though it were the most important task in the world, that caught his attention. Cecily tilted her head and followed her brother's gaze, then smiled. "Rafe, that waitress looks so sad. I hope they leave her alone tonight." Rafe did not answer, but inside him, something small and unfamiliar had just moved, a curiosity he could not name, about the woman the whole room treated as invisible, the woman who, only a few hours later, would change his life completely in a way none of his calculations, none of his plans, could ever have foreseen. Fate, with its strange cruelty, arranged for Maeve herself to be assigned to serve Rafe and his sister's table. When she approached with her order pad in hand, she had no idea who the man seated before her was, and she did not care to think about it because to her, at that moment, he was only another guest, another table that needed careful service, so Moss would not find another reason to blame her. She greeted them with the professional smile that had become reflex, her voice gentle and polite, and Cecily immediately answered with a warm, innocent friendliness rarely found among the diners in a place like this. The girl chattered as she asked Maeve what she should order, then laughed and waved her hands while telling a funny story from school. And it was during that lively motion that her elbow knocked against a glass and sent water spreading across the table, a few drops splashing onto Maeve's sleeve. Cecily panicked, her young face going pale. "Oh no, I'm so sorry. I'm so clumsy. Let me call someone to clean it." But at that very moment, from across the room, Maeve saw Gerald Moss turning his head toward the table, with his watchful, fault-finding eyes, and she knew that if he saw another incident, even one that was not her fault, she would once again have to endure his cruelty, or worse, another deduction from her wages. So instead of letting the girl take the blame, Maeve immediately stepped forward to shield her and said loudly enough for Moss to hear, "I'm sorry. I wasn't careful bringing the water. I'll wipe it up right away." She took the blame so naturally that Cecily stared at her in astonishment, and once Moss had turned away, the girl whispered, "Why did you take the blame for me? I was the one who spilled it." Maeve only smiled gently as she dried the table. "It's all right. You're young. You don't deserve to be scolded over something this small. Let me handle it." Something in that calm kindness made Cecily look at her more closely. And just as Maeve bent down to wipe the table, the corner of a photograph slipped from her apron pocket, revealing the image of a thin little boy holding an old stuffed bear. Cecily saw it and blurted out, "Who's the little boy in the picture? He's so cute." Maeve paused for a moment, then gently picked up the worn snapshot, her finger brushing over the boy's face with an unconscious tenderness. "That's Finn," she said. "My little brother. He's 9 years old." Cecily brightened and asked more. Whether he ever came to pick Maeve up, why she did not talk about him more. And then, for reasons Maeve did not quite understand, perhaps because of the unguarded warmth of this young girl, perhaps because the weight of the long day had softened something inside her, she spoke quietly, her voice lowering. "Finn has had a heart condition since birth. He needs surgery, and I'm trying to save enough money for it." She did not tell her about the loan being denied that afternoon, did not tell her about the sleepless nights. She only spoke in the steady voice of someone used to carrying burdens. "My dream now is very simple. I just want to earn enough so my brother can be healthy, so he can run and play like other children." Cecily fell silent, her young eyes shining with tears, and she said softly, "He's lucky to have a sister like you." Maeve shook her head, tucked the photograph back into her pocket, and said a sentence she had no idea would later matter so much. "You know, every time I see someone young, I see a little of my Finn in them. So I can never stand still and watch a young person come to harm. I just can't do that, no matter what it costs me." She said it simply, like a passing confidence shared during dinner, unaware that she had just revealed the very core of herself. And on the other side of the table, Rafe Collazo, who had been listening in silence all this time, set down his wine glass without ever lifting it to his lips. He had seen countless people fawn over his sister because they knew who he was, had grown used to kindness with calculation behind it, to concern measured out in hopes of gaining something in return. But this woman did not know who he was, had nothing to ask from him, and yet she treated Cecily with a clear, selfless tenderness, the kind of tenderness his money and power had never been able to buy. And for the first time in many years, Rafe felt something inside his chest tremble faintly. Maeve returned to her work, carrying a strange warmth in her chest, from the brief conversation with the kind young girl, and perhaps because her eyes had spent so many years in service, learning to notice the smallest details, she was the only person in the whole restaurant who realized something was wrong. Amid the busy flow of people moving back and forth, a figure entered her line of sight, a man nearly 40 years old wearing a server's uniform just like hers. Yet everything about him was wrong. Maeve had done this work long enough to know what a person skilled at carrying trays looked like, and this man was not that. He held the tray stiffly with both hands, awkwardly, as though he had never carried one a day in his life. There was no name tag on his chest, though every employee was required to wear one. And what made her heart begin to beat faster was that he did not follow the staff route, did not stop by the kitchen area or the service station, but kept moving along the edge of the wall, his cold, sharp eyes repeatedly turning in one direction only, toward the table where Rafe and Cecily were sitting. There was a chilling focus in that gaze, something that did not belong to an ordinary evening, and Maeve's instinct, the instinct of an older sister always alert to danger lurking near the young, sounded an alarm inside her mind. She did not know who that man was, did not know what he intended to do, but she knew one thing for certain. He was not an employee here, and he was targeting someone. Maeve did not hesitate. She quickly set down her tray and went looking for the only person with the authority to stop this, Gerald Moss. She found him standing near the wine counter, inspecting the bottles, and she hurried toward him, lowering her voice but unable to hide its urgency. "Mr. Moss, I need to report something to you. There's a man wearing a server's uniform, but I'm sure he doesn't work for the restaurant. He has no name tag, he doesn't know how to carry a tray, and he keeps staring toward the table of the important guest. I'm afraid something is wrong. If Moss had been a responsible manager, he should have paid attention at once." But Moss did not look at her with the eyes of someone listening. He looked at her with his familiar contempt, the look of a man who believed that a lowly waitress could not possibly know anything worth his concern. He let out an irritated breath. "What are you inventing now?" he snapped under his breath. "Do you think I have time tonight to listen to your imagination? Your job is to serve tables, not spy on people and make up nonsense." Maeve tried to plead again, her voice shaking with urgency. "Mr. Moss, please, just have someone check. If I'm wrong, I'll accept the punishment, but if I'm right—" Moss cut her off, his voice hardening enough to show that his patience was gone. "Listen carefully. If you keep wandering around meddling in other people's business instead of doing your job, I'll fire you tonight. Do you understand? Now go back to your tables." And so, once again on that fateful night, the voice of the person with the least power in the room was brushed aside, the warning of the only person who had seen the danger dismissed as foolishness. Simply because that person wore a worn uniform and stood on the lowest rung of this world, Maeve stood frozen for a few seconds, her heart pounding, knowing she had no power left to force anyone to believe her. But she did not go back to her tables as Moss had ordered. She could not. She spun around, her eyes searching through the crowd for that suspicious figure, and her heart seemed to stop when she saw the man pull a concealed steel baton from beneath the tray and rush toward the table where Cecily was sitting, laughing and talking, completely unaware. In that instant, every thought in Maeve's mind went dark, leaving only one thing driving her feet forward, when the terrible noise had barely died away, and Maeve collapsed onto the stone floor with Cecily clutched tightly in her arms. The whole restaurant seemed to burst open into chaos. But in the middle of that chaos, Silvana Reyes moved as swiftly as a shadow. She rushed over from the table where she had been sitting and watching all evening, and within a few seconds, the strange man was subdued, pinned hard to the floor, the metal object in his hand flying loose and skidding across the stone. Sal lifted her head toward her boss, waiting for an order, and when her eyes met Rafe's gray ones, she understood at once what he wanted without a single word needing to pass between them. By ordinary rules, by the way the underworld worked, a man who dared touch Rafe Collazo's sister should have disappeared that very night, quietly and without a trace. And yes, in the first instant, when rage flared like fire through his veins, Rafe wanted exactly that. But he also did not want the police involved, did not want the light of the law shining into his world, did not want questions, files, investigations that might expose the things he had spent his whole life burying. So he only gave a slight signal, and Sal, together with a few trusted people, quietly escorted the stranger out through the back way, keeping him in a place known only to Rafe's people, waiting for Rafe to decide his fate by his own rules. Rafe had chosen to keep him there, not hand him over to anyone yet, because at that moment there was only one vague idea in his mind, that this man would pay, even if Rafe did not yet know how. But all those cold calculations suddenly dissolved when Rafe turned back and looked down at the floor, where the woman who had just saved his sister's life lay motionless, her face pale, her arms still wrapped around Cecily as though she meant to protect the girl until the very last second of consciousness. Cecily sobbed for her brother, and Rafe knelt beside them, a man who had never gone down on one knee before anyone in his life. It was then that his eyes caught on a small object lying on the stone floor, slipped from Maeve's apron pocket when she fell. It was a photograph with worn edges, and Rafe picked it up with fingers used to power, yet now trembling faintly in a strange way. In the picture was a thin, little boy, holding an old stuffed bear, his clear eyes smiling at the camera, and Rafe stared at that face, remembering in fragments the words he had overheard earlier, about a 9-year-old brother with a weak heart, about an older sister, struggling for every dollar to save his life. The woman lying here, the woman who had just put her own back in the path of the blow meant for him and his sister, was someone who had nothing except a sick little brother and a dream so simple it hurt. She had not risked herself because she knew who he was, had not traded her life in hopes of asking for a favor. She had done it only because, in that moment, she had seen a young person in danger, and as she had said herself, she could never stand still. The ambulance siren wailed outside as the medical workers rushed in, and they quickly placed Maeve on a stretcher, carrying her away amid urgent commands and hurried footsteps. Rafe rose to his feet, the photograph still clenched in his hand, and he watched the stretcher being pushed toward the door with a feeling he could not name. For so many years, he had lived in a world where every relationship was an exchange, where kindness always came with a price, where he had learned not to believe in giving without gain, because he had almost never witnessed it. Yet tonight, a poor stranger, someone the world itself had turned away from, had shown him something all his money and power had never been able to touch. Rafe tightened his grip around the photograph, and for the first time in many years, something deep inside the man who had seemed turned to stone began to crack, and through that crack, a strange, unfamiliar light quietly slipped in. The next morning, when the first sunlight had not yet driven all the cold from the harbor water, Rafe Collazo returned to the salt line, this time not as a guest, but as a man searching for the answer to a question that had kept him from sleeping through the night. At this hour, the restaurant was empty of diners, with only staff moving about as they cleaned and prepared for the evening shift, and the moment Rafe stepped through the door, he heard Gerald Moss's familiar voice, thick with contempt, rising from the far end of the room. Moss was standing in the middle of a group of employees, waving a stack of papers in one hand, loudly announcing what he called the incident from last night. That Donovan woman, Moss said in a voice full of false outrage, abandoned her shift, caused a disturbance in the middle of the restaurant, frightened the guests, and ruined an important evening. I've decided to terminate her immediately. Undisciplined people like that have no place in an establishment of this caliber. Rafe stood still at the entrance, listening as the manager brazenly twisted the truth, turning a woman who had risked her life to save another into a troublemaker who deserved to be fired, and a slow coldness rose inside him. He walked in, each step calm but powerful enough to make the whole room fall silent, and when Moss realized that the powerful guest from the night before was standing right in front of him, his face instantly changed from arrogance into that familiar fawning smile. "Oh, Mr. Collazo, what an honor. What can I do for you? Let me." But Rafe did not let him finish. In a low-level voice more frightening than any shout, he said, "The woman you just called a troublemaker took a blow meant for my sister last night. She is the reason my sister is alive this morning. And you, where were you when it happened?" Moss went pale and began stammering, trying to explain, but Rafe slowly took another step forward, his cold gray eyes locking onto him, and he continued, "I hear an employee came to you last night to report a suspicious man, and you dismissed her. Is that right? You had the chance to prevent everything, but you were too busy looking down on the people under your authority to listen." The whole room held its breath. Rafe did not raise his voice, did not threaten him with a single crude word, yet the authority radiating from him made Moss tremble, and he ended with a sentence as light as wind and as heavy as stone. "Miss Donovan will not be fired, and if I hear that you have made things difficult for her one more time, you will find yourself wondering whether that manager's chair, or this entire restaurant, will still belong to its current owners." Moss lowered his head, not daring to say another word, and Rafe turned away, leaving him standing there with the humiliation he had so often dealt out to others. On his way out, Rafe stopped by the small kitchen in the back, where an old cook with graying hair was quietly washing vegetables, and a thin young man was scrubbing pots. When he asked about Maeve, the old cook's weathered face softened, and she told him, in a voice full of pity, about the girl she had worked beside for years. "That child's had a hard life, sir," she said. "Her mother died young, her father walked out, and she's raising her little brother alone. The boy has a heart condition. She works herself half to death through 2 shifts and still doesn't have enough to get him treated." The dishwasher added, "She's a good person. Every time Mr. Moss blames us unfairly, she steps in and takes it for us. And still, no one ever stands up for her." Rafe listened to every word, and he understood that everything he needed to know about that woman was not in any file or document, but in the words of the ordinary people who stood beside her every day. Maeve Donovan was not a mystery to be investigated. She was simply a person so good it was almost difficult to believe, standing in a world that had forgotten what goodness looked like, and the more Rafe understood about her, the heavier the debt inside him became. Maeve woke in a bright white hospital room, and the first thing she felt was not the dull ache in her shoulder and back, carefully braced and bandaged, but a cold panic running down her spine as consciousness slowly returned. She lay there for a few seconds, staring blankly at the ceiling, then suddenly tried to push herself upright despite the pain that twisted her face, because in her mind there were only numbers spinning wildly. How much did one night in a place like this cost? How much did an emergency treatment cost? If she could not work in the days ahead, how would she pay the rent? And worst of all, with the little money she had scraped and saved for Finn's surgery, now be swallowed whole by her own hospital bill. That thought stole her breath more sharply than the physical pain, and she began fumbling for her phone, meaning to call Mrs. Alvarez and ask whether Finn was all right, meaning to find a way to leave the hospital early, no matter what the doctors said, because she could not lie here spending money she did not have. It was in the middle of that frantic panic that the door opened, and the man in the black suit stepped inside, the man she dimly remembered as the older brother of the girl she had saved the night before. Rafe stood there for a moment, silently watching the panic on her face, then said in a low, rough voice he had tried to soften, "You don't need to worry about anything. I've taken care of all the expenses here, the hospital bill, the medicine, even the days you'll need to rest. All you need to do is focus on getting well." For someone drowning in financial despair like Maeve, those should have been words salvation, a miracle in the middle of ruin. But instead of relief, her blue-gray eyes lit with a pride Rafe had not expected. She gave a small shake of her head, her voice weak but firm. "I'm grateful for your kindness, but I can't accept it. I'll manage on my own." Rafe went still, as though he thought he had misheard. In all his life, no one had ever refused what he offered. People begged for his help, knelt before the things he gave, and this was the first time someone, especially someone with so little, had dared to say no to him. "You don't understand," he said, his voice touched with a rare confusion. "This money is nothing to me, and to you it could lift a great burden. Let me help. You saved my sister." But Maeve looked straight into his eyes, and in that gaze there was none of the fear other people always gave him, only the tired steadiness of someone used to standing on her own feet. "I didn't save her to be repaid," she said. "I did it because in that moment it was the right thing to do, that's all. If I take your money now, then what I did last night becomes a transaction, and I don't sell my kindness, sir." She paused to draw a breath, then spoke more softly. "I'm poor, yes. I'm buried in debt, yes. But the only thing I still have that belongs to me is my self-respect, and that is something I won't trade for any price." The room fell silent, and Rafe stood there looking at the thin woman lying in the hospital bed, a woman who held nothing in her hands yet possessed something he, with all his power and wealth, had lost long ago without even knowing it. He realized that his desire to help her did not come from pity, not from the feeling of someone above granting mercy to someone below, but from something entirely different and unfamiliar. For the first time in so many years inside a world full of false faces and calculation, he had met someone truly good, a goodness whole and unstained, and he did not want to buy it with money. He only wanted to be near it, to learn from it again the thing he himself had dropped somewhere along the long road to becoming the most powerful man in the city. And instead of becoming angry because he had been refused, Rafe did something even he did not expect. He gave a slight nod, and inside him rose a deep respect for the woman brave enough to say no to the whole world. That night, after leaving the hospital, Rafe sat alone in his high-floor office overlooking the harbor glittering with lights, the small photograph of the boy named Finn still lying on the desk before him, and the resolve in the eyes of the woman named Maeve kept returning to his mind like an echo that refused to fade. Self-respect, she had said, was the one thing she would not trade for any price, and that sentence had touched a place deep inside him, a place he had sealed away long ago, from the day his whole world collapsed, because there had been a time when Rafe Collazo, too, had been a clear-hearted boy, a 15-year-old who believed life was a straight road leading toward good things. He remembered the small warm house from long ago, remembered the smell of bread his mother baked every morning, remembered his father's deep warm voice telling stories at the dinner table, remembered even the thin newborn cries of the baby sister his parents had named Cecily. That was the only part of his life when he had truly been allowed to be a child, allowed to live without looking over his shoulder, allowed to believe that tomorrow would always be safe. But then everything shattered in a single night. He never told anyone the details of that night, not even Sal, who had stayed beside him through the long years afterward. He remembered only that his parents had been taken in a bloody incident between underworld forces fighting for control of the harbor, a reckoning his family had been dragged into by accident, though they had never belonged to that world. And in one night, the 15-year-old boy woke to find he had lost everything. No father, no mother, no home, only a 3-year-old little sister sobbing in his arms, and the most terrible helplessness a human being can taste. He had held Cecily that night, the little girl understanding nothing, only crying for her mother, and he had whispered a promise to her, even though he did not yet know how he would keep it, that he would protect her, whatever it cost. That helplessness was what haunted him most. Not the grief of loss, but the helplessness, the feeling that he was too small, too weak, too empty-handed to protect the people he loved from a cruel world that spared no one. He had sworn to himself that he would never taste that feeling again, that he would become so strong no one could ever take anything from him again. And to keep Cecily safe, to raise her, to build around the two of them a wall no force could break through, he had stepped, piece by piece, into the very world that had stolen his parents from him. He had not chosen that road out of greed, not from hunger for power or money. He had chosen it because it was the only road an empty-handed boy could take, to make himself into someone no one dared touch. Year by year he climbed higher, became cold-headed, and lost little by little the clear-hearted boy he had once been, lost even the part of himself his mother had once cherished. He had become the man who made the whole city bow its head, but the price was that he could no longer remember the last time he had believed in anyone's goodness. And now, sitting in the dark with the photograph of a strange little boy in his hand, Rafe realized a truth that tightened his heart, that the woman named Maeve, though she had no power and no wealth at all, was doing exactly what he had sworn to do when he was 15 years old. She was fighting with everything she had to protect her small brother, and she was doing it without losing herself the way he once had. A few days later, something Maeve had never dared dream of happened. Finn was transferred to the very hospital where she was being treated, placed in a proper room to prepare for the heart surgery she had been struggling for through so many months. She did not know how it had become real, only that even though she had refused to accept money, some invisible hand had quietly removed the obstacles from her path, and somewhere deep inside, she vaguely guessed who was behind it, though he had never admitted it. But within that fragile hope there was another worry, because Finn, the small 9-year-old boy with the weak heart, was terribly frightened. On the night before the surgery, he lay curled on the hospital bed, his large round eyes bright with tears, his arms wrapped tightly around the old stuffed bear whose fur had worn thin, and he whispered to his sister in a trembling voice that he was scared of the cold operating room, scared of the machines that went beep beep, scared that if he closed his eyes, he might never open them again. Maeve sat beside his bed, one hand still bandaged, holding his small hand, trying to press down her own fear so she could smile and comfort him. But she knew there are childhood fears that even an older sister's love cannot fully soothe. And it was at that moment that the door opened softly, and Cecily stepped in with a bright smile, a stack of colored paper, and a box of colored pencils in her hands. The 19-year-old girl had asked Maeve and the nurses for permission to visit the little boy, whose sister had saved her life with her own back. And from the moment she entered the room, Cecily brought with her a kind of warm light that eased the tension in the air. She sat down beside Finn's bed, introduced herself with friendly ease as though they had known each other for years, then spread the colored paper out and invited him to draw with her. "You know," Cecily said gently, "when I was your age, I was in the hospital too, and I was very scared. But then my brother taught me a secret. Whenever we feel afraid, we should draw the place we most want to go when we get better, and think about it very hard. Then the fear gets smaller." Finn hesitantly took the blue pencil, and with Cecily's gentle encouragement, he began to draw, first a large ship on the sea, then a pier full of seagulls, because he said his greatest dream was to one day go with his sister Maeve to the harbor, to watch the ships without running out of breath, to run and play like other children. Cecily listened to every word, sometimes adding a cloud, a sun, a sail to the drawing, and before long, the boy's little giggle sounded through the room, the kind of laughter Maeve felt she had not heard fully in such a long time. She sat quietly in a corner, watching the young girl patiently warm her frightened brother's tender heart, and her own heart filled with wordless gratitude. Those two children, one raised amid every kind of hardship, the other raised in luxury yet deprived of ordinary family warmth, had somehow found each other, and connected through the simplest language of childhood, innocence and kindness. When the night grew late and Finn finally drifted to sleep, with the drawing of the ship laid neatly on his chest, Cecily gently pulled the blanket over him, then turned to Maeve and said softly, "I've never had a little brother, but if I did, I'd want him to be like Finn." Maeve smiled, and in that moment, though their two families came from worlds separated by an immeasurable distance. Though there were still so many things ahead that neither of them could name, an invisible thread had been woven between them. The thread of wounded people finding one another and beginning, little by little, to heal one another. The truth broke open one afternoon, when Maeve was walking down the quiet hospital corridor to pick up her medication and accidentally passed a small waiting room where the door had been left half closed. Inside, she recognized the low, level voice of the woman named Sal, the one who always moved silently beside Rafe, and she stopped short when she heard words that were never meant for her ears. Sal was reporting something in a voice so calm it chilled the blood, mentioning control of the harbor, men who had been dealt with, the boss's orders needing to be followed absolutely, and the way she spoke of those things, as casually as people discussed the weather sent cold racing down Maeve's spine. Then, through the crack in the door, she saw two powerful men standing guard on either side, saw the way they lowered their heads when Rafe stepped out, saw the absolute authority radiating from him, something she had mistaken until then for nothing more than the manner of a wealthy businessman. In that instant, all the scattered pieces that had been lying apart in her mind suddenly locked together, the way the entire restaurant had bowed and trembled before him that night, the way the attacker had been quietly taken away, without a single sign of the police, the invisible hand that had arranged everything so Finn could be admitted to the hospital. All of it became suddenly, terrifyingly clear. The man who had helped her and her brother, the man whose younger sister had grown fond of, was not an ordinary benefactor, but a boss of the underworld, the head of a force like the very forces that had taken so many lives through tragedies just like this. Maeve stepped back, her heart pounding, and hurried back to the room with a panic entirely different from her old fear of hospital bills. That night, after Finn had fallen deeply asleep following his successful surgery, Maeve stood by the hospital room window, looking out into the darkness, her hands clenched tightly together, and when Rafe came to visit as he usually did, she could no longer keep silent. She stepped into the hallway with him, deliberately moving away from the door where her little brother was sleeping, so the words she was about to say would not reach Finn's young ears. "I know who you are now," she said softly, her voice trembling, but trying to stay steady. "I know what you do. I know the world you belong to." Rafe was silent. He did not deny it, and that silence confirmed everything. Maeve drew in a deep breath, her eyes lit with fear, not for herself but for her small brother. "You've helped us so much, and I'll be grateful to you for the rest of my life for that. But I can't. I can't let Finn grow up near a world like that. A world where violence can fall at any moment, where people are dealt with quietly in the dark," she went on, tears threatening to spill, though her voice remained firm. "I lost my parents. I've seen how cruel this life can be, and the only thing I live for is keeping Finn safe, letting him grow up clean, letting him believe there is still goodness in this world. I can't trade that away, even if the person bringing danger near us is also the person who saved us." Rafe stood there, listening silently to every word she spoke, and each word was like a blade touching the deepest place inside him, because she was giving voice to the very fear he had carried all his life, the fear that the world he had built to protect the people he loved might, in the end, be the very thing that destroyed them. He did not grow angry, did not argue. He only looked at the woman trembling out of fear for her brother, and he understood that she was not wrong, that her fear was justified, that with all the kindness and honesty she had given him and his sister, she still had every right to want to keep her brother far from the darkness. And for the first time, Rafe faced a question he had never dared ask himself, whether the world he had chosen long ago to protect Cecily was also the prison holding her captive, and holding him captive too. Maeve's words haunted Rafe for days, and perhaps that was why he finally decided to do the thing he had been putting off for so long, to face the man who had caused it all, the man his people were still holding in a hidden place near the harbor. When Rafe stepped into the room where that man was being kept, he did not bring with him the fury he had expected to feel, only a heavy curiosity, a need to understand how a human being could hold on to hatred that deeply. The man lifted his head and looked at him, and for the first time, Rafe clearly saw his face, a harsh face carved with deep lines of pain and bitterness, sunken eyes burning with a fire Rafe recognized at once, because he had seen that fire before long ago in his own eyes. "You don't recognize me, do you?" the man said, his voice rough and hoarse. My name is Albie Trent, and you ruined my life years ago." Rafe remained silent, and Albie gave a bitter laugh, then began to speak, not in the voice of a killer, but in the voice of a man who had lost everything. He told him about the days when his gang still controlled a corner of the harbor, about the old confrontation when Rafe's power rose and crushed every rival in its path, and about his only younger brother, who had died in that bloody struggle for control. "My brother was only 20 years old," Albie said, his voice breaking. "He had never hurt anyone. He only followed me because he had nowhere else to go, and then he died because of wars fought by men like you, men like me, while you climbed higher, became richer, more powerful. And I lost everything and lived all these years with only one thought, to make you taste the pain I tasted, to take from you the person you loved most so you would understand what it felt like." Rafe stood motionless as a cold realization settled over him. In Albie's bitter words, he saw a dark reflection of his own past the tragic cycle of a world where violence only bred more violence. Carrying this heavy truth, he left the room just as his people confirmed the final piece of that fateful night. His people confirmed that Maeve truly had warned Gerald Moss about the suspicious man that night, and Moss had brushed her words aside out of contempt, had held in his hands the chance to prevent everything, and thrown it away simply because he could not be bothered to listen to someone beneath him. When that truth spread, together with quiet pressure from Rafe, Moss quickly lost everything: the manager's chair, the polished reputation he had built over the years, and the false respect he had mistaken for power. All of it dissolved into smoke, leaving him alone with the arrogance that had destroyed him. But Moss's downfall brought Rafe no satisfaction, because his mind was now caught on a larger question, one that Albie, through the force of his own hatred, had placed before him: whether Rafe would keep walking the road that had turned one tragedy into countless others, or whether he would be brave enough to stop. That night, Rafe returned to the room where Albie was being held, and this time, inside him was a struggle more violent than any battle he had ever faced. By the rules of the world he had lived in all his life, the answer should have been simple. A man who dared touch his sister had to disappear. That was how things had always been settled, cleanly, decisively, without mercy. For so many years he had grown used to putting an end to every threat, and one part of him, the part that had turned to stone after all those years in darkness, was screaming for him to do what he had always done. His hand rested on the cold metal object at his side, and in that moment he looked straight into Albie's eyes, at the man sitting there without begging, only looking back at him with a weary resignation, as though he had been waiting for this ending for a long time, as though death, to him, would be lighter than continuing to live with the hatred that had eaten him down to the marrow. But in the very second Rafe's hand touched that power over life and death, Albie's face suddenly blurred, and in its place, Rafe saw his own face at 15 years old, the child who had lost everything and sworn to take revenge on the whole world. He saw Cecily's clear eyes, saw the young smile of Finn drawing a ship on his hospital bed, and he heard in his mind the words Maeve had spoken to him. Words she had not said to lecture him, but only because they were what she believed from the bottom of her heart. She had come to him earlier, knowing he was tormented, and standing before him, those blue-gray eyes looking at him without fear, she had said, "Do you know, if you end his life, you won't end anything at all." He once had a younger brother he loved too, and who knows, somewhere out there he may still have someone, and that person will come looking for you, carrying the same hatred you're holding in your hand right now. Violence has never been a period, sir. It's only a comma, and after every comma, another tragedy is written, another child loses someone they love, another spiral begins and never stops. The only person who can put a period at the end of this story is the one brave enough to lower his hand first. Those words echoed inside Rafe's mind like a kind of light shining into the darkest place in his soul, and the hand resting on that cold metal object began to tremble, not from fear, but because for the first time in his life he was fighting himself, fighting the man he had become, fighting the spiral that had imprisoned him for 20 years. He thought of all the other Albies his world had created, all the pain that had multiplied from hands like his, and he understood that if he tightened his grip one more time, he would never escape, would remain forever a link in that cruel machine. And then, slowly, as though setting down a burden he had carried for an entire lifetime, Rafe lowered his hand. He took one step back, drew a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was rough but strangely steady. "I won't take your life," he told Albie. "Not because you don't deserve punishment, but because I'm too tired of being the man who plants more pain like the pain inside me. You'll pay for what you've done, but you'll pay before the law, not before me." Then he turned to Sal, who stood silently watching the whole moment, with a rare look of astonishment on her usually cold face, and he gave an order she had never in her life thought she would hear from him. "Deliver him and all the evidence to the authorities anonymously. Make sure it is done through proper legal channels without tracing back to our operations. And this time, we'll let real justice speak." In that moment of lowering his hand, Rafe Collazo, the man who had once made the whole city bow its head, felt truly free for the first time. Finn's surgery lasted for many hours, and throughout all that time, Maeve sat waiting in the hallway with her hands clasped tightly together, while beside her, in a way she never could have imagined, Rafe and Cecily waited with her too, as though they had truly become a family. When the operating room doors finally opened, and Dr. Priya Nair stepped out with a tired but radiant smile to tell them the surgery had been successful, that Finn's small heart would beat strong and healthy. From now on, Maeve broke down in tears. For the first time in so many years, she allowed herself to cry, but these were tears of overflowing happiness. In the months that followed, all their lives changed in ways none of them could have foreseen. Rafe began doing what he himself had once thought impossible. Step by step, he withdrew from the underworld that had imprisoned him for 20 years, redirected his resources into legitimate businesses, and dismantled one link at a time of the dark machine he had once led, not in a single night, but with the patience and determination of a man who had found a reason to change. And to turn the pain of the past into something meaningful, he established a charitable foundation called the Donovan Foundation, a fund dedicated to helping poor working families with loved ones suffering from serious illnesses. Invisible people society so often forgets, people struggling for every dollar the way Maeve once had. But the most important thing was that Rafe did not turn Maeve into someone receiving charity. He did not place her in the position of a person bound by gratitude. Instead, he invited her to run the foundation herself, because he understood that no one could understand the suffering of those people better than someone who had lived through it. And so Maeve Donovan, the waitress who had once been scolded and treated as invisible, now became the person who reached out to lift up countless other lives, seen, heard, and respected for the human worth she had always possessed. On a late autumn afternoon, both families went together to Boston Harbor, the place Finn had once dreamed of visiting. The boy was now rosy-cheeked and healthy, running joyfully with Cecily along the pier, their clear laughter blending with the sound of waves and seagulls beneath, the golden sunset spreading over the water. Maeve and Rafe stood side by side watching the children, and after a stretch of silence, she turned to him, her blue-gray eyes filled with a tenderness she had never given anyone before. She remembered that fateful night, remembered the words she had whispered while holding Cecily close. "Don't be afraid. I'm here now, and now," looking at the man who had once been lonely inside his own fortress of power, the man who had been brave enough to set down the darkness and step into the light, she softly spoke those words to him again, this time with a completely different meaning. "You're safe now, too." Rafe turned to look at her, and in that moment, the man who had once made the whole city bow its head understood that the safety she spoke of was not safety of the body, but the peace of a soul finally healed, finally freed from the hatred and fear that had followed him his entire life. And standing there in the harbor sunset, two people from worlds separated by an immeasurable distance found in each other something neither money nor power could ever buy: peace, trust, and a true home. The story of Maeve and Rafe reminds us of something simple yet profound, that a person's worth has never been found in status or wealth, but in the goodness they are willing to give, even when they have almost nothing left in their hands. That one act of kindness, however small it may seem, can light even the darkest corners of a life, and that none of us is so lost that we can never turn back. None of us is so strong that we don't need healing, and kindness, together with the courage to let go of hatred, is the light that can guide a person back to themselves. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so we can spread meaningful stories to even more people, and so every day you can listen to more moving, emotional stories with us. How do you feel about Maeve and Rafe's story? What part of this story moved you the most? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep in your heart, because we always hope to hear your sincere thoughts and emotions. Thank you for spending your time listening to this story all the way to the very last moment. May you and the people you love always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and love filling every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.